Welcome to CCG Global Dialogue, live from CCG head office here in Beijing. Let me quickly introduce our key guest today. Professor Laura Summers has enjoyed a distinguished career spanning over 4 decades of one of the American leading economists in both academy and government. In addition to serving as the 71st Secretary of the Treasury in Clinton administration, Dr. Summers served as the director of White House National Economic Council in the Obama administration, and also as the president of Harvard University and chief economist of World Bank. Dr. Summers has played a key role in addressing every major financial crisis in the last 2 decades and has been recognized as one of the world's most influential thinkers. We are at critical time of this pandemic fighting, the global economy, and you actually introduced the idea of a circular stagnation in 2013 to explain the combination of a long period of easy monetary policy with weak demand and a disappointing growth. We know that the US inflation is hitting probably a new time high now. And so as the largest economy in the world, what do you see the US economy in general? And then we would probably talk a bit about a global economy.
So let me describe my view prior to the pandemic, my view during the pandemic, and then my view after the pandemic. What I foresaw in 2013 was that the world economy had changed quite profoundly. That instead of the issue being too much demand colliding with insufficient supply, that there was so much desire to save for retirement, so much wealth going to very affluent people, so much reduction in the price of capital goods, particularly those involved with information technology, and such profound demographic change towards much slower labor force growth, that I felt that the challenge was going to be a chronic excess of saving. And I felt that the traditional mechanism of adjustment based on interest rates was going to be problematic. I worried that excessively low interest rates would actually lead to more financial instability and financial bubbles. And so I felt that what we were likely to see was low interest rates, sluggish growth, and very limited inflation reflecting the sluggish growth. And I think that's a pretty good description of the industrial world from the period after the financial crisis up until COVID. When COVID hit, I had a strong recommendation. That strong recommendation was that we do everything we can to contain the spread of COVID, and that we very substantially support incomes and demand. And that's what the United States did in 2020 very, very successfully. By the time we got to 2021, it was pretty clear that the US economy, anyway, was recovering and recovering at a fairly rapid rate. And so I looked and I saw that our level of income was perhaps $30 to $50 billion short of the economy's potential. And I felt that it was important to close that gap. What we actually did was not $50 billion a month of stimulus, but more like $200 billion a month of stimulus. And at the same time, we ran extremely expansionary monetary policy and had the Federal Reserve grow its balance sheet very, very rapidly. The result I predicted at the beginning of 2021 was that we would have substantial inflation because the bathtub would overflow. There was more water flowing in the form of demand than there was capacity of the economy to produce, especially given the various distortions and destructions and implications of the pandemic. And that's in fact what has happened. When you get to 7% inflation, is that demand is running very, very strong relative to supply. And that unless an effort is made successfully to balance supply and demand, we will have continuing high inflation and possibly even accelerating inflation. And therefore, it was my view, going back to last spring, that monetary policy needed to start adjusting its path to recognize that overheating was our economic problem, and that fiscal policy needed to be conducted in ways that would reduce stimulus rather than increase stimulus. Unfortunately, my advice was a minority opinion, and policymakers followed what was a majority consensus opinion that inflation would be entirely transitory and wouldn't be a serious problem. And so we now find ourselves with much more rapid wage growth, much more rapid price growth, and a great deal of anxiety about inflation. The priority now, in my view, has to be on reducing the overheating of the economy. That's going to make a set of substantial challenges for the Federal Reserve. I do think that the fact that real interest rates for 10 years, even for 30 years, are negative is telling us something quite profound, which is that secular stagnation is something that is in remission, not something that has been ultimately cured. And I think that we are going to have to think very hard about the right kinds of policy approaches for the medium term. But if we don't deal with the inflation that we have right now, I think we're likely to have even larger problems in the future.
And actually, the annual inflation rate in the U.S. has scored to the 40 years new high in the last months of 2021, accelerating to 7%. So that, will probably impact the world and also, of course, the U.S. economy. So that's probably every country is watching on that. Let's talk a bit on the world economy. Actually, about 10 days ago, we had an event with the World Bank. The new Prospect Global Economy Report was released with CCG and the World Bank. So what do you see the world economy out of this, stagnation of, inflation in the U.S. and then, what's, the World Bank actually lowered the forecast for all the economies?
Let me say, Henry, that I have learned to have enormous respect for China and for Chinese policymakers and people from the West who see problems and then think that China is going to run into all kinds of difficulty, have a history of not turning out to be right. So it's very difficult to judge what's going to happen in China. That said, I think that China faces three major challenges over the next 2 years that are going to take enormous skill to deal with. The first is the exit to normal from COVID. In the United States, we have a population where half the people in the United States have had COVID. I have COVID as I'm speaking to you, fortunately, a very mild case, so I am having no difficulty participating in the conversation by Zoom. But that fact and our use of mRNA vaccines means that we have the capacity to manage COVID moving from pandemic to endemic, from it becoming a relatively normal part of life in the same way that the flu is a relatively normal part of life. I think the challenges for China, given that China hasn't had mRNA vaccines on a very large scale, and given that China has had this remarkable success so far with its lockdown policies of making a transition back to normality, is going to be a very important challenge for China. I think the second very important challenge for China is going to be, where is the demand going to come from? China is an extraordinarily high saving country. The question is, where is all that saving going to go? And there have been periods when all that saving went into exports, but I think the rest of the world is going to have limits on its willingness to accept large-scale Chinese trade surpluses. There have been periods when it has gone into infrastructure, but China, having laid more concrete between 2010 and 2014 than America did in the whole 20th century, is got a pretty splendid infrastructure, and there's a limited capacity for new infrastructure projects. For a significant time, it's gone into real estate, but we're seeing substantial financial excess in the Chinese real estate sector with Evergrande. And so the question of how is China going to manage its saving is, I think, a very substantial uncertainty going forward. I think the third uncertainty, and it's the one that an outsider like me can speak to with the least confidence, is that the extraordinary uniqueness of the Chinese economic system has much to do with the very special role of the party and the very large role of state enterprises. And on the one hand, that has led to a very great capacity for coordination. On the other hand, it has led to substantial political elements in the economy. And the question of balancing state and market going forward in a period where it appears that the state is wanting to assert a greater control, both through more channeling of capital to state enterprises and more extensive regulation of private enterprises, what that will mean for initiative, entrepreneurship, and growth is, I think, not entirely clear. So I think that just as we have substantial challenges in the years ahead, China has substantial challenges.
You know, how we strike a balance between this zero tolerance and open up the economy and to the world, you know, so people can start to come. China is now having this Beijing Winter Olympic now. I think we are experimenting some of those openness, and hopefully we will get more, get into international pattern as time goes on. I think you're right, but you know, in China it's a unique model, you know, where SOE play a lot of role as well. But of course there's a challenge, how do we can really stimulate entrepreneurship and strike a balance. You're absolutely right, you know, we need to find that balance.